Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome back to the One Sitting Orphan podcast. I'm Jasmine, and joining me today is Terry. We are talking another adoption story. Terry, I didn't say this a moment ago, but I absolutely love and I enjoy meeting other adoptees.
Yeah,
That commonality that we share, it creates a different bond and a different connection that you may not have otherwise with someone who was not adopted. So
yeah. We kind
thank
of
you so much.
understand each other.
Yes, the moment you say you're adopted and you know
Hmm.
that I'm adopted, you automatically understand each other. And
That's
it's a
right.
different type of understanding, which I absolutely love. So thank you.
Right.
So Terry, let's get started. Adoption for
Yeah,
starters,
sure.
good experience or bad experience?
Good experience. I
Great.
had really wonderful adoptive parents, and they were really great. They weren't able to have children biologically. My adoptive mom had a goiter on her neck near her thyroid, threw her hormone levels out of whack, and she was not able to have children. And so they decided to adopt, and both my sister and I was adopted in 1966. My sister was adopted in 1968. But no, great adoption experience, great adoptive parents. They may not have been biologically been my parents, but they read all the books and the Dr. Spocks and all the books, and were wonderful adoptive parents, and I'm sure provided a much better life than I could have had with my birth mother.
I 100% agree because I share those sentiments. I too had a great adoption experience. My parents, like I told you, had five before
Hmm.
me, making me the first adoptee, and it was absolutely great. Your sister now, was she your biological sister or was she also
No,
adopted?
she was also adopted. We were both adopted from the Sellers Baptist Maternity Home, or Sellers Home for Unwed Mothers in New Orleans. I'm from Tupelo, Mississippi, birthplace of Elvis. We'll give a little bit of shout out there. Um, and my adoptive parents, as I said a moment ago, they realized they couldn't have children. Might be something today in 2025 that doctors could have worked with and tried to overcome, but just didn't have the technology in the mid 60s. But they went to Sellers Home for Unwed Mothers uh, in New Orleans, and that's where I was adopted from. I was about 3.5 months old when I was adopted, so I did spend a little time as an orphan there in the Sellers Home in New Orleans.
Now, do you know the circumstances behind why you were adopted?
I do, and I was fortunate enough back in 2019 to meet my birth mother, and we actually had a very close relationship for 16 months, and so she told me the story. Basically, she had been the man who she thought was her father, and through the DNA process, we found out actually wasn't her father. But that's a whole different story, I guess. But the man she thought was her father was a lifer in the Air Force. In other words, he'd been in the military pretty much his whole career, adult life. One of his last stops was in Japan. And really, they have a very homogenous society in Japan. The Americans don't really go out and intermingle in that culture. So the only experiences that she had in her formative teen years with dating was just with maybe kids who were there on the base like her, and not a lot of contact with the outside world. Of course, she comes back in the mid 1960s. Vietnam's getting fired up, and I'm sure these young cadets, once her dad came back, his last stop was at Eglin Air Force Base, or Herbert Field in North Florida near Fort Walton Beach. And to be honest, she came back in this turbulent culture from Japan, not really having a lot of dating experiences at 14, 15, 16, 17, like a lot of us might have. And I think she met up with this young Air Force cadet that really probably was pretty sexually aggressive from what she's described, and maybe really didn't know how to say no. And within a few months, she becomes pregnant. Once he finds that out, he doesn't want anything to do with her. And her parents at the time were going through the process of a divorce, and so she felt like she just didn't have the home structure. At the time, she was 21. The birth father was 20, and she just didn't feel like she had the home structure or the family support at the time to raise me. And she had grown up in Wisconsin. She was Lutheran, and not a lot of Lutherans in the South. And so she attended a Methodist church, and they were affiliated. They didn't really have their own adoption facility, So they hooked up with the Baptist there in the community, and she decided to give me up for adoption. And she went to when she got about 7 months, I guess, she went to the facility in New Orleans, and I was born. And she said she thought about keeping me briefly, but decided that it would be the best thing that I was adopted.
Do you now, in hindsight, do you thank her for that decision?
Absolutely, because uh, I think maybe it probably came out at that time that, and she never knew it. She never knew that the man she thought was her father was not her father. And my wife and there, when we met with her, we're sitting there biting our tongue, wanting to tell her, but we knew it probably wasn't the best thing to tell her. She's like, I don't know why he didn't want anything to do with me after that point. And we knew the story. We knew why. We knew that it probably came out that he was not her father, and I think that was probably part of what was going on with them and their family. But I'm sorry, I probably lost track of your question. But
No, no, no. I was asking if you were happy that she made that
yeah,
decision.
yeah, yeah. And so absolutely,
Yeah.
because my adoptive parents, as I said earlier, were really, really great adoptive parents, and I'll tell you something's really funny. We got really Barbara and I, her name is Barbara, and we got really close, and we lived about 5.5 hours away because she was still in North Florida when because I was 51. And that was in 2017 or 2017 when I began my search. Found her in 2019, and so at that point I'm like 53 years old, and but she was there, and it was really, really great to connect with her.
Yeah.
But it was funny. She would call. That's what I started to tell the story. She would call, and my adoptive mom at that time was going through Alzheimer's and dementia, and she would call, and it was so funny. She would say, "Well, how's your mom doing?" And she knew her place. Barbara knew her place as the birth mother, and she knew that my adoptive mom was my mom. And it was just kind of funny how she knew her place. But yeah, it was great connecting with Barbara, and I'm so glad we were able to help her at the end of her life.
Yeah, Terry. So I didn't even tell you all of this. As you're talking, your story sounds a lot like mine because I searched and then I found my biological mother when
Hmm.
I was actually 30. I was still living in New York at
Okay.
the time. And
Okay.
then I wrote her a letter the following year.
Mhm.
And then I met her a year after that. So I was 32 when
Okay.
I met her. I had 11 years with her. But like you said, she also knew her place. Like when I would speak to
Yeah.
her, she would always ask how my mother was doing. Who my mother is and who birthed me, they are two different people. So,
Right.
and I love that Barbara knew that. How old were you when you found out you were adopted?
Well, and I'm gonna actually have. I think you said didn't you say you're a substitute school teacher? Is
Yes.
it okay to ask about?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I'm a high school social studies teacher. I teach U.S. history, and I tell my students all the time. I said I knew that I was adopted. I don't ever remember not knowing I was adopted,
Mhm.
and I think it is. I tell my students. I said if you're in a situation where you have to adopt, I said please tell the child that they're adopted. Do you agree with that?
100%.
Okay, and
100%.
yeah, and I tell my students if you're ever in that situation where whatever reason you have to adopt, you can't have children, or it's a family situation where you adopt another family member, I said, I said, tell that child that they're adopted. So I don't ever, Jasmine, I don't ever remember not knowing that I was adopted. And in
Yes.
fact, my sister and um, we actually went to the Sellers facility. It was still in New Orleans at the time. It's actually the more rural area of Louisiana now, but it was in New Orleans at the time. And we actually went there and visited the orphanage while we were young children. And I can remember seeing the cribs, and I can actually remember going there when I was probably about 4 or 5. So we actually went to the facility from which we were adopted.
Terry, I'm smiling as you're telling your story because the adoption agency, it was called the Angel Guardian Home
Mhm.
in Brooklyn. And even though I was my parents' first adoptee, so I will often go with my mom when she had, the other foster children, taking them to have visitation with their biological family members and such. And like you, I remember walking through the gates.
Hmm.
It's been, God, 30 plus years probably since I've last been there. They no longer operate, but one of the things I actually look forward to doing is visiting, because the building is still standing right there on, is it 19th Street? 19th Street, 19th,
What part of New
here
York?
in Brooklyn.
Brooklyn.
Yeah, it's now an abandoned piece of property, but
Yeah.
like you said, I remember going in there seeing cribs. I remember going in there and seeing like the doctors, and when they had visits with the social workers and things like that. So I'm like, oh my God, like your story sounds a lot like mine, just maybe a decade apart or something like that. And
Yep.
in two different places. Absolutely amazing. Now, were you your mother's only biological child, or Barbara's only biological child?
Yes. Barbara, I was her only biological child. She did tell us that she dated some after after I came along. She did date some, but she never married. She never had other kids, and she was an only child, and so she really didn't have anybody in her life at the end of her life. As I mentioned earlier, her family was originally from Wisconsin, so she had three first cousins in Wisconsin. She had one that had moved to Florida that she was slightly estranged from, and so she really had nobody. And her mom had passed away in 2014. And so she really had nobody in her life toward the end of her life, except for a few friends there in the Fort Walton Beach, Florida area. And so I really think it was a blessing for us and her for me to be there and help her at the end of her life. And my wife and I found that really, really rewarding to be able to do that.
it's I'm laughing because this connection, the story connection, is just so eerie to me. But I had 11 good years with my biological mother until she passed away. But let me ask you this, because I want to know if we have this thing in common. When Barbara transitioned, did you mourn her death?
Um, yeah, absolutely. And it was very interesting. She didn't really want anybody to know. She didn't want her first cousins to know. Now she said, after I'm dead and gone, you can tell everybody. So when I got the call from the assisted living facility that she was at, my wife and I, we knew she was in declining health, and and we got the call that she had passed away. And so I actually called. I had looked up information for all of her first cousins, and so they're all shocked. Wow, Barbara had a son. We didn't even know that. But yeah, we mourned her death. I worked with one of her cousins to make the funeral arrangements. Of course, this was in 2020, so it was during COVID. And so, basically, we had to do all the funeral arrangements remotely from Mississippi to North Florida, and we had. Then I was working through her cousin because there was an insurance policy involved. But anyway, but absolutely, we mourned her death, and my wife and I, our biggest regret is we only had 16 months. You had 11 years with your mom.
Right.
We only had 16 months with Barbara,
Um,
and but we could have had longer, but my birth father did not reveal her identity. And then that was a big frustration on our part that he did not identify her sooner.
oh my God. Now,
That's a
did you?
different part of the story.
Yeah. Can we get to that? Did you ever
Yeah.
find him?
Yeah. So birth father was very easy to identify. I had strong DNA matches. Um, Happened to run into a biological cousin who was Mormon or LDS, Latter Day Saints, and that's one of the tenets of their faith is to help people connect with family. And so she very quickly, within 2 weeks, we knew who my birth father was. So we very quickly figured out who he was. We made contact with him, and my wife reached out to him. We reached out to him by email and just trying to get that contact going. And basically, his response was, I don't want to pursue a relationship at this point in my life. I think he knew. It was pretty obvious that he knew that
Yeah.
she had, that his girlfriend had become pregnant, and so no connection with him. He actually turns 80 next month. He's still among the living. Have not connected with him or um, any of his four children. Um, he had two children with his second wife and two children with his third wife, none by the first wife, and and so And but what's, you're talking about healing and you talk about frustration,
Mhm.
is not only did he not want a relationship with me, which is his choice, he actually discouraged his four kids from having relationships with me because I would just send them. I contacted each of them, reached out to them, sent them a letter, and said, "Hey, you have a biological half brother, and there's no doubt about it. The
Right.
DNA was very clear, and have not had contact with any of them. But supposedly that's by his doings. He encouraged them not to have contact with me, and I was actually in contact with his brother. He only has one brother. I was actually in contact with his brother and his wife, and we were communicating, and she shared pictures and things like that, and that was going really well. But he steps in, puts a stop to all that. I'm just glad before he did that we were able to get some baby pictures of him and his brother, and get some things that gave us a little bit of the family history, before we were basically shut out. And so that's the healing part that I need, because that was very frustrating. Number one, that we had less time with my birth mother because it took about 2 years to find her,
Right.
and because it was especially confusing with her dad not being her dad, or the man she thought was her dad not being her dad. So that threw off a lot of the DNA, and then the other part of it was is that not only that, he discouraged his entire family from having any contact with me. But I found a way around that.
You tell this story with the strength of a rock, because
Yeah,
how do you manage to grow up adopted? You are an adult now when you find your biological
yeah.
mother.
I was
You
52
find your
years old, 53 years old, 52
right.
years old. Yeah,
You find your biological father. He doesn't want anything to do with you. You are the only biological child by your mother. And then
right.
when you learn that you have half siblings, biological siblings by your
Yep, yep,
father,
yep.
they don't. Everyone is like, no, no, Terry, no. Like, what
That's
is
right.
that? Come on.
It's frustrating, but it sort of made me more determined to reach out to other members of his family. And so I'm like, well, you know what? If I'm not going to have a relationship with him, I'm going to have a relationship with some of his cousins. So, me living in the South, he actually has a cousin that lives in Louisiana, in Baton Rouge. Nicest man ever. Invited me to come to his home at Thanksgiving. My wife and I have visited in his home at Thanksgiving on a couple of occasions, and I think three for me and one for my wife. And we've met his family. He's been so accommodating, and my birth father knows. He knows about all this. So I don't know if that's frustrating to him or not, but I'm just glad that his first cousin had the free will and said, "I'm not going to play your games. I'm
Right.
going to meet your biological son." And then I've also met family. He was from southeastern Iowa, or is from southeastern Iowa originally. And I've been up there. I visited his hometown. Another first cousin on a different side of the family took me around, showed me the home he grew up in, showed me the cemetery where relatives are buried, showed me family homes where grandparents lived. And so I kind of got the experience of learning about my biological family despite him not being involved, or my birth father's family despite him not being involved. So it's almost like kind of like I'm getting back at him a little bit.
Right. And I don't know if I'm wrong for saying this, but good. Because how do you, and I get it, when you're young and you're silly and you make decisions you shouldn't make, granted. But in those decisions, a life is created.
Yeah,
So
that's
you are
absolutely
now
right.
at an age to say, hey, son, I was young, I was silly, I made some decisions I shouldn't have, and you were the result of that, and I should not have, walked out of your life, whatever. But now, at as a senior citizen, you should absolutely want to know your child. Do you have any biological children, Terry?
Yeah, I have two sons. They are 26 and 24. So,
Well, your father
and
doesn't know.
no, he doesn't. Well, I mean, we sent him a letter saying that, yeah, we've got two children. So he
Right.
knows. He got
Yeah.
a letter informing him that he has
He knows
biological
about them,
children.
but he doesn't
He
know them.
knows about them, but he doesn't
Right.
know them. No, no.
Uh, so that part of the story never sits well with me.
Yeah,
Um, it never sits well with me because your grandkids don't know you.
yeah, that's
Are
right.
they in a position to meet their cousins? I mean, because they could marry a cousin or date a cousin. Those are the things that always. just runs
Yeah,
through my mind.
I mean, I don't think that's going to happen because I live in North Mississippi. He was from southeastern Iowa. My birth mother's from Wisconsin. I don't worry too much about that kind of stuff. I mean, you hear stories about stuff like that happening and nobody knows, and I don't really see that in this case happening. But but I see how hey, if you're all in the same community, I see how it could happen.
Yeah. And that's the reason, going back to what you said a moment ago, it's so, I tell adoptive parents all the time, and I know that there are some who says, I'm not going to tell my child. And what I tell them is that when the child does find out, they're going to hate you. Thank
Yeah,
yourself now. They're going to hate you because every adopted child should know that they are adopted.
I agree.
And I've said this before, when my mom and dad had to talk with me, I was roughly 9 years old. So I had already known that I was adopted, but the talk filled a lot of pieces. So my
Mhm.
mom told me, hey, you can't come home with a boy named this because that's your brother and he lives in this town. I mean, my
Right,
brother and I were so close, we were probably 2 miles from each other. But we were zoned to different schools, and so we never knew each other until two
right.
years ago.
Well,
Oddly, right. Oddly, we crossed paths so many times, though,
mhm,
where we grew up in the same town. For a good while, they relocated to the West Coast. But then when he came back to the East Coast, he lived in Georgia. He lived in Georgia. Where he lives now is a town that I've always wanted to live in. Like, we've had opportunities where we couldn't cross paths. So had his mom not told him, had my mom not told me, God only knows how ugly that could have gotten.
right,
So, and I mean, I just don't understand what adoptive parents are thinking when they decide, I'm not going to tell them. I
right.
tell them, they're going to hate you. When they find out any other way, they're going to hate you.
Well, let me give you an example. We had a girl that lived down the street from us, and the family moves in. They're new. Everybody, we were 12, 13 years old. We knew the girl was adopted. My parents told me, said, hey, she's adopted just like you and your sister. And so we get invited to go over to their house swimming, and we get head down there. She was probably 10 or 11, maybe a little bit younger than us. And we get there, oh, hey, you're adopted just like us, man. That's awesome. And she's like, what? She didn't know. And she was like 12, probably 11, 12 years old. And she did not know. And, I'm sure that was a tough conversation when her parents had to explain that. Um, yeah.
That's a very tough
Tough.
conversation because by 12 years old, the child is old
Yeah.
enough to
Oh,
know
yeah.
they are adopted and to understand what adoption is and what it
Oh,
means.
yeah. Oh,
You know,
absolutely.
um,
Absolutely.
I'm like you, Terry. I'm thankful for my adoption experience because, as I stated, with my birth mother having a drug addiction, she was in no position to raise a child
Right. Right.
at all whatsoever. Get me out of Brooklyn and take me to Long Island. I
Right.
mean, perfect for me. I had a mother and father who was married. Um, we had a family. It was just a family. It was how you see families operate.
Mm-hmm.
I want to go back for a second. You
Sure.
stated, Terry, that you knew, and I want to make sure I'm understanding this. Did you know that the man who raised your mother was not her biological father before she knew?
Yes. And she never actually found out. She never found out. And she was very hurt by the fact she said, after they divorced, he didn't even support me financially. He never tried to help me. He didn't have anything to do with me after that point. And I think it probably came out that he was not her father. But she was always very hurt by that. You could tell. And I had pictures of them when when she was younger that they seemed close, but she was, I think, and I understand him finding out, well, she's not my biological child. I understand maybe he was frustrated that maybe he had been kept out of the loop. Perhaps I don't know for sure, but yeah, like I said, my wife and I, we knew, and she actually never knew before she passed away. We never told her. Um, we wanted to, but it just during the 16 months we had together, the time just never got right to tell her that, well, he was not your father.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
So was she the result of an affair or was she from a previous relationship? Do you know?
Yeah, and I even hinted at her one time. I said, because I'd found records of her parents' marriage, or again, the man she thought was her father. I had found records of their marriage, and I even said to her one time, I said, they didn't marry until she was like 2 or 3 months pregnant with you, and she said, yeah, I know that, but I don't think she ever connected the dots that another man was her father. I don't think she ever connected the dots on that. So yeah, I just don't think she ever figured it out.
So, what does that do to you, Terry, to know that your mother left Earth without knowing the two
You
people?
know, I mean, my wife and I felt like that it may have been hurtful for her to find out that her mom had kept that from her,
Right,
and so that was another whole aspect of it. Is we were concerned, well, it might make it hurtful to her. It might give her some understanding of why the man she thought was her father, you know,
right.
didn't continue to affiliate with her. It might have given her some understanding in that regard, but it also might have created some animosity going back to, well, why did my mom just tell me that? Why? Because she obviously never did. It's very clear that she never did.
I'm always at a loss because the older generation, they are the best at keeping secrets and
Hmm.
not being forthcoming and transparent. And I don't know, of course, being younger, I don't know where that's from. I don't know if it's the shame, the guilt that they carry. I just don't know, but I believe it's so necessary for everyone to know, at the very least, who conceived them. Like at 46 years old, Terry, at least you have found your biological father. I don't even know my biological father's name. So that search continues. If I ever get lucky, maybe, maybe not. But it's still that missing piece, right? So your
Hmm.
mom lived an entire life with that missing piece.
That's right. And I don't know if the man who was her father, I know who he was. I actually know who her biological father was.
Well,
I've actually communicated with some of my mother's half sisters,
mm.
um, and I know who he was, and I know what his name was, um, and so anyway.
Did he
But
know about her?
I have no idea. I have no way of knowing.
Okay.
I don't know.
Oh.
He was deceased. I think he died in 1999. So I
Mm.
don't know if he ever knew,
Right.
um, if Barbara's mother told him or not. But she clearly married another guy when she was about 2 to 3 months pregnant. So
Ooh. These it's stuff like this that makes the stories way more interesting
yeah,
than just a regular adoption story, because every adoption story is different, and with that we get to see all the missing pieces and how this piece is missing from us, but this piece was missing from my biological mother or my biological father, or this
exactly.
piece was missing from my biological grandmother or grandfather.
Yep,
So it goes back generation to generation to generation, and
it
then it
does.
falls on us. And we are the generation now, Terry, where we're trying to find the pieces and put the puzzle together.
Right.
Um, and sometimes that can be overwhelming, right?
Yeah. Well, that kind of brings me to another point that I
Sure.
haven't talked about yet. I'm actually, because I had a very difficult time finding my birth mother, took about 2 years. Um, a search angel, the DNA search angel, actually, very talented DNA search angel, actually helped me find my birth mother. I had gone, the sellers adopted, there's an adopted from sellers website. I had gone onto the site and I just happened to run across this search angel who was volunteering that day and said, well, I think I can help you. And so, what we had been working on for 2 years, she comes in a very short amount of time, kind of figures things out. She says, I don't think your birth mother's father was her father. And so, we figured that aspect out. Thankfully, there was enough DNA on her side that we were able to figure out. And this is what I tell people who were doing, I said, leave no stone unturned.
Agreed.
And because you know how I saw this? I actually requested at the time, Louisiana today, like many states, has a law that allows adoptees to obtain their original birth
Yeah.
certificates. Okay. And I'm sure you're probably aware of that.
Hmm.
Um, but at the time, that law was not in effect in Louisiana. And so at any rate, this search angel is helping me. She's assisting me, and she tells me, okay, And so anyway, she says you can apply for your adoption decree. And I said, well, I've already got my parents actually saved a lot of records for me. They saved my non-identifying information. They saved my the official document from the court that made me theirs. And she said, oh, here's what you need to do. She said, go to Orleans Parish or online, order your adoption decree. A lot of times they won't redact out the names. And so I actually learned my birth name, which should have been redacted. I learned it from my adoption decree, and it said Robert Louis Jurgensen. Turns out, the man Barbara, who thought was her father, his name was Robert. She had a favorite uncle named Louis. I thought it was from the writer Robert Louis Stevenson, um, but no, it was family names. And
Oh,
so my original name was Robert Louis Jurgensen. And so I had the name Jurgensen. Thankfully, there's not a lot of Jurgensens in the South. And I just start searching Jurgensen, and and that part I did on my own. And I remember one day after school, there was another teacher, young teacher, several years younger than me, who had been kind of following my story. And I said, I think this lady right here is my birth mother. And turns out that was her. We found Barbara Jurgensen in Fort Walton Beach, Florida, and that was my birth mother. And so that's when I contacted her, and she said, "Okay, I'm willing to meet. And when can
oh,
you and your wife get here?" And so,
amazing.
yeah, and so the search angel made such a difference in my life. I asked her. I said, "Can you teach me to do what you did for me?"
Right.
And so she did. She took a case that she had already solved, and she said, "I want you to. This is a good case. It'd be a good practice case, and learned how to do the um, search family obituaries, search records on ancestry, search census records." And she taught me how to do all these things. And to date, I've helped over 50 people connect with their birth families.
You are kidding me.
More than 50. Yep. So I
Terry,
sure
that
have.
is amazing. Good for
Yeah.
you. Now look, now I'm gonna ask for your help. So
Hey, that's fine.
this is amazing. Oh my God. So now I didn't tell you my story before how I found my birth mother, right?
Okay.
So the
Okay.
funny thing is my mother, I always knew my last name. My mother, what it was at birth. My mother told
Mhm.
me, she was like, your name was this, and I don't know your mother's first name, but her last name was this. And so I'm like, okay. She was like, she's in Brooklyn, and I just knew very little. And then one day in 2009, I tell the story all the time. My mom kept this old raggedy brown suitcase where she kept all of our important documents, birth
Mhm.
certificates, social security cards, everything,
Mhm.
all of our adoption records, everything in this suitcase. So we go inside the suitcase, and I was like, she's pulling out paper. And I'm like, Mommy, that's nothing. She comes across a piece of paper that has something whited out.
Mhm.
So, that was the main way to keep a secret back in the 70s,
Oh
right?
yeah.
Let's
Oh
put
yeah.
some white out on. No one thought that it was going to dry one day. So she scratches off the whiteout, and voila, I learned my birth mother's name for the first time. And I'm like,
Mhm.
oh my God. So I go to the internet, I find her phone number, I called her. I called her for like
Mhm.
3 days. I didn't get an answer until a Friday night. I called her, and the conversation was, hi, I'm calling to speak to, and I stated her name.
Sure.
She goes, this is she. And I said, hi. I said, this phone call is going to come strange. I said, my name is Jasmine. I was adopted at birth. I am in search of my biological mother. I know that her name is, and I'm wondering if that's you. She goes, I don't think so. Now, off the bat, if you know you didn't birth a child in 1978, you would automatically say,
Right.
no, that's not me. I'm sorry. But she said, I don't think so. I
Mhm.
asked, are you sure? She said, yeah, I think I'm pretty sure. So I ended the phone call. I said, I'm so sorry to bother. Thank you so much. And I ended the phone call, and I said, oh my gosh, she's still living. Because,
Mhm.
with her drug use, anything, we know how that goes. But I
Sure.
knew it was her. So I got home that night to my mom's and I said, Mommy, I said, I spoke to her. I spoke to her, Mommy. And she's like, You spoke to who? And I'm like, I spoke to her. She goes, Well, what did she say? And I was like, She told me I had the wrong number.
Yeah.
And
That's
my mother,
very common. I find that a lot.
very. And it wasn't until, like I stated earlier, I wrote her a letter the following year and then she responded. But my mother's question was, How do you know that was her? And it was almost like that maternal connection. Like I just knew it. I
Right.
felt it. And I
Right.
was like, Mommy, that's her. And she goes, You think so? And I said, Mommy, I've never been so sure about anything else. That was her. She's
Mhm.
still living. And my mother, she understood me in the moment. She was like, Okay. And she was like, All right, well, she may not want to be bothered. Now, oddly, my biological mother, her wish was to die without knowing any of her biological children. But I searched and searched and searched. I wrote her a letter and I let her know that I wasn't angry with her.
Mhm.
And once I let her know that we were able to maintain a healthy relationship until her passing, because I was not angry with her, I was more thankful than anything. There are some adoptees, Terry, and you may know that are angry about their adoption. They
Oh
hate the
yeah,
thought of
absolutely,
adoption. They think
absolutely.
it's not something that anyone should ever do. They believe they are completely against adoption. How do you feel about that? What do you tell those people?
Well, I had a case like that, and the guy was in Louisiana. You know, talking about trying to escape a pregnancy, an unwanted pregnancy. The birth parents, I think, were 20 and 16. They wanted to keep him. They wanted him, and but there's a little bit of an age difference, and so they were from New Hampshire. The mother did not want the daughter to keep the baby, so she moved. I guess she had family in New Orleans. They moved from New Hampshire to New Orleans. She has the baby at Sellers, so it was another Sellers adoption.
Mhm.
She has the baby. He gets given up for adoption, and but this man was really really hurt by the fact that they had given up for an adoption. So I was so glad that I was able to connect them. And now, ooh, listen to this story. The birth parents, they were broken up at 16 and 20. When they left the state, and her mom took her 800 miles away to have the baby, and she lived in New Orleans, married a guy in New Orleans. Well, years later, the birth mother went back to New Hampshire to take care of her aging father. And so she runs into the old boyfriend and they start dating again and they got married. Unbelievable. And then they were looking for him at the time I identified them. It's just one of my best adoption stories. They were looking for him. And so they actually traveled from New Hampshire to the town in Louisiana where he lives, and they connected and they were able to explain, well, why this is why we were basically forced to give you up for adoption. But what I tell people is, I said, you don't know the circumstances. You
Mhm.
don't know what was going on. I had another birth mother who, for example, her mother had died of cancer when she was real young. Her dad died when she was 16. She had to be raised by her older sister. And, she basically um, hooked up with a man in her late teens, that basically took her in when she had no other family. And, she ended up pregnant. But later in life, she had kind of gotten her act together and actually, had a good life. But, she said, that's just a part of my life that, I don't want to go back to. She did give the adoptee the courtesy of giving her a call and explaining things. But, that's what I tell you ask, well, what do you tell them?
Yeah.
I said, you don't know that person's story. In this case, we had actually learned, we knew that the birth mother,
The
the birth
grandmother.
mom's mother had died. We knew that her dad had died. We had learned all that, but but I just that's what I tell them. I said, you don't know their circumstances. You
Yeah.
don't know maybe what they were like. The other story I mentioned, what they were forced to do.
Right.
They were basically forced to give you up for adoption. So that's
Terry,
what I try to tell them. You just don't know. We don't
right.
know. Sometimes we do know. That second example I gave, we kind of did know, but sometimes you just don't know what was going on in that person's life that maybe was a legitimate reason for them to give you up.
Absolutely. Because the thing is, if adoption was not a thing, The only thing that I think of is that I would have been raised by a drug addicted mother in the
Yep.
Bedford Stuyvesant section of Brooklyn, New York.
Yep. That's
Um,
I've heard
right,
of it.
in Bed-Stuy.
Mm-hmm.
And that would have been my upbringing, which would have been completely different from
Oh
the
yeah.
upbringing that I had. As an adult now, I'm more thankful for the life I was given.
Absolutely.
I'm more
Me
thankful
too.
to my biological mother for the decision that she made because she knew I deserved better, you know? And so some adoptees feel like, but my only thing with adoption is just keep it open. Just keep
Yeah.
the records open because
Yeah.
these adoptees, we should be able to go back in our adult lives and say, hey, I want to find this. And it should not be so hard. But
Yeah. And I am glad to see that a lot of states, many states, you hear about new one. In fact, I think I just read where I can't remember what state it was, but they were there lobbying the legislature to change the laws, and many states have made it where adoptees can get their original birth certificate. Of course, it's only going to give you the mother most of the time. It's not going
right.
to give you the father most of the time. So your situation where you still don't know who the birth father was. You're not going to probably learn that from an original birth certificate, but at least you can learn who your mother was. And then if
Terry,
she's still living, maybe she can tell you.
Terry, so that's the only reason why I haven't ordered my original birth certificate because I'm almost 100% positive my birth father's name is not on it. That's the
Very
only
likely.
reason why I didn't order it. I mean, in New York, only made it possible for us to order our original birth certificates. I want to say in 2019,
That sounds
maybe
about right.
2018. In recent years, that's not that long ago. Um, yeah,
Many states since then,
right.
many states have changed the laws since 2019.
Yeah. And
Right.
it's so interesting to me because so my birth mother, get this, she had given me a name before
Okay.
she passed away because of course I asked, well, who's my biological father?
Sure.
She'd give me a name. So and because I worked in collections, I can find people. I have
Yeah.
a background
Oh
in
yeah.
collections. I usually go to the computer and I'm like, da, 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 da. I'm like, here it is. But the name she had given me, I see this name this is the name of an individual who at one point resided in Brooklyn, but it almost seems like he had fallen off the face of the earth. I don't
Hmm.
know anything else. And so, but my DNA is not connecting me to anyone with that name.
Hmm.
So I created this own theory in my head, Terry. So, and I don't know how true this is. This is just my theory. This is what I made up. But I get the feeling that my biological father
Okay.
was conceived by one of the men who I actually am connected to
Hmm.
um, on Ancestry, but this affair happened outside of his wife
Hmm.
or outside of a solid relationship,
Right.
and
Right.
so my biological grandmother likely took the child, lived somewhere else, and my biological father has no idea of who his father could possibly be.
Okay. Yep. Yep.
That's just my theory, and I hope that makes sense to you.
Yeah. It does. It does.
Yeah, but because the name that I was given is there's not the last name isn't even the same. And it could
Mhm.
be because if they weren't married, during those days, the mother would give the child her last name.
Right.
I just I'm not even anywhere closer to it today than I am when my birth mother gave me the name.
Right. I got
But I am thankful that my father, my real father, my adopted father, who's now deceased, he filled that void. He had given me everything every little girl should have,
you.
as a
Right.
daughter, right?
Right.
So when you help people, do you always tell them, or do you ever tell them like, "Hey, I'm going to do my best, but just be prepared in case things don't go this way for you."
Yeah, absolutely. I tell people, I said, you've got to go in this with realistic expectations. It may be a situation like my birth father, where we identify him, but he wants no connection. I said, and there's always the chance that maybe we don't identify the birth father. It's pretty rare that I don't, but there's sometimes we don't always get to identify the birth father. But yeah, I always try to make sure that they are mentally prepared for whatever may come. There may be a connection, there may not be a connection. And yeah, you have to have realistic expectations going in. And that was one of the things the lady who mentored me said. If you don't think that person is mentally stable enough to handle whatever the news is, you should probably turn down their case until, at least unless until they're a point when they are mentally prepared for whatever comes. Because you can't go into this thinking, well, it's all going to come out roses and or there's going to be a connection. You have to have realistic expectations
You
for sure.
have to have realistic expectations. And I
No doubt.
think when you go in it with that mindset, it keeps you from being hurt and disappointed,
It does.
you
Yeah.
know? And for those of us who, like yourself and me, who had a really good adoption experience, it's not going to be so hurtful, if that
Right.
makes sense, because
Right.
I still had a mother, I still had a father. So
Right.
when I finally made contact with my birth mother and she was like, "Oh, you have the wrong number," I was like, "You're a liar, but at least I know you're still living." And it didn't bother me. And so that takes me to the point, when I asked you earlier if you mourn her death, despite the fact that I had 11 years with my biological mother, Terry, I didn't mourn her death. And I think it's because I felt her loss in 1978 opposed to 2021.
Right. Right.
And so when I say that, I hope that doesn't sound mean. I hope I can be understood when I say that, because my mother is still living.
Right.
So, and I didn't want to seem so insensitive, but the truth is I lost her in 1978. I didn't lose her in 2021.
Right. Right. 1966 for me. So
So
yeah.
when
So
you hear me say that, what does that sound like to you?
I get it. I mean, I understand it. I get it. I understand where you're coming from that. And and I mentioned that I did say that my wife and I mourned the loss of Barbara, and we did.
Yeah.
And part of it had to do with the fact that we only had 16 months together.
Yeah.
Um, Part of it, because it was COVID and we didn't have more time with her at the end, because literally we could not physically go into the facility
Right.
where she was, assisted living facility where she was. And mentally she was sharp. Physically, her body was just worn out. She was just worn out. She had been a waitress, and on her feet, pretty much her whole adult life. And she just had poor circulation, and she just didn't get around very good. And it was frustrating, that we didn't get to spend more time because my birth father wouldn't tell her who she was. It was frustrated that we lost time with her because of COVID. And so, part of the morning was more that we didn't have more time to be able to spend with her,
Yeah.
because the time that we did have before COVID, the brief time that we had before COVID, was very rewarding. But no, but I mean, but I get what you're saying, and I get it. 100% get what you're saying. That yeah, you had that morning many years earlier, and and 2021 was just the end of her life,
Yeah.
and not necessarily a time to mourn. I get that. I get it.
Terry, when you met your biological mother, did you see any resemblance, whether in personality and physical characteristics? Was there anything that you felt like that connection?
Well, absolutely, because I've got pictures. I look way more like her than my birth father. So I've got pictures when she was maybe 8, 9, 10 years old. I've got pictures when I was that old, and I look like a male version of her.
Yeah.
So I look way, way more like her. So yeah, and let me tell you a funny story. We had been on the road 5.5 hours. We get there to North Florida from North Mississippi, and we go straight to the assisted living facility. She said, "Give me an hour, 30 minutes heads up before you get here." She said, "My mobility's not very good. I'll come downstairs," because I think she had an upstairs room. And she said, "I'll come down. I'll meet you downstairs, and then we'll go to dinner." And so we had been on the road 5.5 hours. We get to the restaurant. We walk in. We agreed on seafood, and I love seafood, and she likes seafood. Anyway, we go in the restaurant, and I said, "I've got to go to the bathroom." I said, "I'm sorry. I hate to walk out of the meeting right as we get here to the restaurant." I said, "I got to go to the bathroom." So I go to the bathroom, and I come back, and my wife is just bawling, laughing. And I said, "What's so funny?" And she said, when the waitress came to take our drink order, she asked Barbara, did she want sweet tea? And she said, no, I hate sweet tea. And that's me. I'm the exact same way.
You see?
I said, I hate sweet. I'm from the South, but I hate sweet tea. I said, I like unsweet tea. And so we spent the whole meal comparing notes on foods that we liked. And if the few that we didn't share, she said that she was saying, you must have got that from him. So the few that we didn't share in common, she was like, "You must have got that from him." So
Oh
so
my
it was
God.
we just loved Barbara to death.
Yeah,
It
that's
was a
so
great,
sweet though.
yeah, that was awesome.
I asked that because it's so funny. When I met my birth mother, I saw um, so much. We had so much in common. The way, the things we laugh at, the way we saw things, the way, and then of course there was that physical resemblance, right?
Oh yeah,
But I was just like, oh my gosh. So one day I had gone to New York to visit, the family, and I called her and I was like, hey, I'm in town. I wanted her to come by my mom's house and meet my mom and things like that. And she was reluctant to, which I can understand. So she
sure.
said, well, let's meet at the diner. And I was like, well, my mom is coming, because I felt like at the very least, you should see my mother. Like, hello, say hello, something. And so they did. And so I remember asking my mom after, I said, Mom, do you think I look like her? And she goes, I don't think so, but y'all act the same. And it was just so
Hmm.
funny. And I mean, I think there was physical resemblance. I don't know if I look exactly like her, but you definitely
Hmm.
see some similarities. But our personalities were exactly the same.
Hmm.
It was the weirdest thing. And so I finally had someone to mirror, because my whole life I grew up with people saying, oh, you look just like your dad. And I'm like,
He's not my dad.
he's not my dad. Oh, you look just like your dad. I mean, even his siblings who knew I was adopted, it was a lot of, you look like your dad. And I'm like, how can I possibly, y'all, But now when I met her, I was like, oh, so now I see it. And so when I saw that mirror, when, physical characteristics and our personality, it was the thing that I felt like it was almost the thing that made me whole. Now, of course, there's a whole nother side of me, but meeting her was like, oh my God, it was like filling my cup. So, and of course, you felt the same way when you met
Oh,
Barbara.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Instant connection,
I
instant
love that.
connection. And then when she shared pictures of when she was young, and I've got one, I'm sitting here looking across the room at my refrigerator right now. There's a picture of Barbara at probably, I don't know, 10, 12, that looks just like me when I was 8 or 9.
Oh my
And I mean, and so yeah, I keep that picture, even though she's passed in 2020. I keep that picture on the refrigerator and reminded of how much I look like her every day.
God. I
And
love that for you. And I know your wife had to be like, wait a minute, this is definitely your mother. She's
oh,
she's
I
definitely the
mean,
woman who carried you.
yeah, when she saw the pictures of Barbara when she was young compared to when I was young, she's like, well, there's no doubt about that. No doubt at all. You look just like Barbara.
Yes.
So,
Now, Terry, before I let you go, let me just ask you this. Growing up and when you learned that you were adopted, because I already
mhm.
shared with you like the shame that I carried, did you ever at any point feel, how did being adopted make you feel when you learned? And
you
what
know,
when
I
you learned what
think
adoption was?
Yeah, I think because I had good adoptive parents, I think because I knew that, they picked me out of all the other babies available, at least at the Sellers home in New Orleans,
Hmm.
and they picked me. I think that they sort of, my adoptive parents sort of instilled a sense of pride that I was adopted. And I think, it's like, you're special because we picked you.
Yeah.
And so I think that probably, so no shame at all. You know, and I think, again, it kind of did make me feel special that they picked me.
I 100% agree. And I think, and what I want the takeaway to be is, for anyone who sees this, if you're thinking about adopting children, be open with them, be honest
Yep.
with them.
Yep.
That's not going to be as harmful as you keeping a secret and not letting them know. If you
Right.
want to adopt a child, be willing to put your feelings aside, be willing to tell the child that they are adopted and be okay when the time comes that they want to find their biological families.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right? Would you say, would you would agree?
100%. And I've actually had a conversation with an adoptive parent about this, and very much similar to my story. He told his daughter, "You're adopted. We know who you're in." And this was when in the early 2000s, when the beginning to be more open adoptions,
Yeah.
and so they knew who the birth mother was, and they said, you know, uh, when you get 18, and we think you should wait till you're 18. We want you to find out. We want you to go. And so it makes me very proud that, that some adoptive parents are very open to that idea. Um, my birth mother, because I was so old when I started this at 51, and then really didn't find my birth mother until I was 53. Um, my mom, her dementia was advanced to a point that we really weren't able to discuss it much. On one of her better days, I did ask her, and she said, "Oh, I'm glad that you're finding out." And now she probably didn't remember that conversation an hour later, but I was glad that she was able to express that,
Yeah.
and that she was glad that I was able to find out.
It is so meaningful for the child. And I know a lot of parents choose the age 18. Do you feel like it should be done sooner? Or how do you feel about them learning about their adoption at age 18?
I don't know. I really hadn't thought about that a lot. Um, I think, yeah, I definitely should tell them well before then. Like I said, I don't ever remember not knowing.
Yeah.
Uh, I don't ever remember not knowing that I was adopted. Now, part of that may have had to do with the fact that my sister was adopted after me, and my parents probably would have to explain, how are we coming home with a little
Absolutely.
adult with a little sister?
Mhm.
But and that may have been part of their motivation to tell me at such an early age, because I was 2 when my sister was adopted. But I don't ever remember not knowing.
Mhm.
But as far as waiting till you're 18, I kind of get that. I kind of get it. You want to be a little older and more mature, and because, as we discussed earlier, you need to be able to handle whatever comes,
Right.
and not all teenagers are maybe ready for a bad outcome,
Right.
or an
Yeah.
outcome. Maybe you find out they're deceased, or that it doesn't go well, and that's a lot to put on a kid. But
Yeah.
18, they're a young adult at that point, so I think I'm okay with
I
that.
think I kind of agree, but I also feel like it's all in how the adoptive parents handle it.
Yeah.
In your
Oh,
case and in
absolutely.
my case, because we knew very young, it was a matter of how we were treated by our parents and those that we called mom and dad, right?
Exactly.
Opposed to, and when, because that void was never there as a child, it didn't really feel like, oh, I need to go find them. Now, if a child is being raised by adoptive parents who are abusive,
Hmm.
negligent, and all of those things, by all
Oh,
means,
yeah.
that child is going to want to, who do I come from? And they're going to
Right.
want to know sooner. So it's
Yeah.
the age 18, it can go either way. So it's always because that 18-year-old might say, well, how come I didn't know sooner? But then, if you tell them sooner, you don't want to discombobulate the child as they're still, trying to finish school and go through those
Right.
things. And it's just, it can go either way.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
But I love these conversations. I love it. I love these moments. I love meeting adoptees. And I love when you are open to share your story and be fully
Oh,
transparent. You don't know how much that means to me. And I just want people to really understand what it looks like to be adopted. And I want adoptive parents to really understand that you're going to have to tell the child.
right.
You're going to have to tell your child. If you don't want to do it when they're younger, then wait until 18. But please don't take it to your grave, because
Right.
there are some adoptees who found out that they were adopted after
Oh,
losing
yeah.
both adoptive parents.
That's right.
Now that creates a different level of trauma, hurt, um, you know, so much more. So be open to being fully transparent with your child. It is not their fault that you couldn't conceive, perhaps, or that they were abandoned or neglected. It's not the child's fault. So
Right.
they shouldn't have to bear that burden. You have to tell the child.
Yep. I agree wholeheartedly.
Yeah. Terry, thank you so much. I love this.
Yeah, it's good having a conversation with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I love moments like this. I think every moment is a teaching moment, and like we learn from each other. The more open and honest we are, we learn from each other. And it is our job to teach each other. Each one teach one. And so if we just open and just talk about it, guys, I promise this world can be a better place. I promise it can. There's no
Yep.
room for judgment here. We talk in fully transparency, and we just love it. We love these moments. And Terry, I just thank you so much.
All right. Glad to be with you.